Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Today, we have a very special guest. We have Scott Graybeal, CEO of Caelux. Hey, Scott, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Sean.
And I think what we're going to talk about today is Perovskite. Did I pronounce it right?
Pretty close, Perovskite.
Yeah, Perovskite. You know what's kind of cool about it? So it's a solar cell technology, but it's got a PV in it. I like that. Makes my life a little bit easier. So
Right.
we can sort of say PV squared or something like that.
Yeah, we say PVK or PVSK.
Great. Okay. So maybe you could explain what perovskite is and what makes it special.
Yeah, there's a little bit of confusion out there. Perovskite is a mineral that's found in nature. It's a calcium titanate mineral, but it has nothing to do with what we do. But perovskite in our world refers to the crystal structure of the devices that we fabricate. So what we and other companies in the perovskite space do is synthesize nanomaterials that have a crystal structure that matches that of naturally occurring perovskite. If that makes sense.
So perovskite's in nature. Where do you find it?
Mountains, there's certain geologic formations. It's calcium titanate, so I don't think it's that rare. Fortunately, I'm not a geologist, but it was named for a Russian mineralogist by a German geologist back in the 19th century. And the gentleman's name was Perovsky. So that's where the name perovskite comes from. But the crystal structure is like a stretched out octahedral type of structure. And so sometimes we'll find other materials share that kind of naming appellation where it looks like, under a very sophisticated microscope, it does resemble different naturally occurring species, and they'll apply the same name to an artificial species. So in our case, a perovskite is just a mixture of metals and nonmetals that under certain processing conditions create this type of crystal structure. And the neat thing about these materials, there seems to be just a tremendous number of applications, but in our case, we use it to produce very low cost yet powerful solar cells.
So you said it's calcium titanate. So that's calcium and titanium?
Yeah, calcium, titanium, and oxygen. That's the naturally occurring material. Ours is quite a bit different. So all perovskites share a similar chemical formula, or as they're described, of ABX3, where A and B refer to the positively charged species in the crystal structure. The X refers to the halogens, so the stuff all the way at the far end of the periodic table that comprise these, the other parts of that crystal structure.
Great. And so it's a semiconductor with a PN junction and all that?
You have to create that. So you would create that by putting down different layers to go and create that junction.
Okay. And so from what I know, it's typically in practice when people are using it for solar right now, it's combined with silicon, I guess, like multijunction.
You can. It's not a requirement. There are companies that make single junction perovskite solar cells, and there are companies like ours that make a hybrid tandem, and we're the leaders in the hybrid tandem approach, where you're depositing the perovskite material on a layer of glass, and that glass is then used in the fabrication of the solar module. So you electrically have the crystalline silicon cell and the perovskite cell are electrically isolated except for their parallel connection inside the module. And the other approach is a monolithic tandem, where you would deposit the perovskite layer directly onto the silicon.
So let's think about that. So it's on the glass, like the regular solar glass?
Typically, we need to use low iron float glass, which is very common in thin film solar applications. But yes, it would replace that solar glass. And so we call our product an active glass.
So how does that work with like the silicon cells that you're putting it with? Because the cells are typically different shapes. Do you make them the same shape?
No, we just deposit on one sheet of glass, and then we'll scribe that, semiconductor material, photoactive material, into a number of these different solar cells. They don't have to necessarily be geometrically aligned. In between the glass and the silicon solar cells is usually going to be a piece of lamination material, just like in any module, except our glass generates electricity. And so they're connected electrically in parallel inside of the module. So you would take charge collection tape. One side would be connected to our bus bar, if you will, and the other end of it would be connected to the crystalline silicon DC bus. And that would be the connection inside of the module. So you match the voltages and you add the current that come out. So at the back end of the module, you still have just the same number of leads coming out of the junction box as you would a traditional module. So there's no change there. That's a little bit of a misunderstanding for a lot of folks. They think about what we call four terminal. They think, oh, I need to have two junction boxes that are separate, one for the perovskite, one for the crystalline silicon, and you don't.
That's super interesting. So you must get a certain amount of solar cells that's a particular ratio to match the voltage of the crystalline silicon?
That's exactly right. So we're able to match voltage to just about any crystalline silicon cell array. We haven't seen one that we've had an issue with. And this gives customers a lot of flexibility in terms of cell type, configuration, what voltage they want to go to market with. We take their design and we match to their voltage.
So it sounds to me a little bit like you get what some people call like solar windows, where it's like a transparent solar piece of glass, and then you get it to match the voltage of a solar module, and you just use that for the glass that goes on the solar module?
That's right. And I don't know if your listeners will be able to see this, but I'm holding up what today serves as one of my coasters on my desk. But this was our prototype from our pilot line that we had. And you can see that there's these long strips. Each of these strips is actually a solar cell.
Okay, so thin film solar, most people aren't going to be looking at this.
Right.
And so thin film solar is a lot of stripes.
Lots of stripes.
Typically what you see like First Solar or something like that. So just like these long, narrow cells, because we're not restricted by the crystal where we have to make them more like square or circle, something like that.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so that's pretty cool how that works.
So you can kind of think about it as a compound solar module. You've got a thin film component now, and you have the crystalline silicon component, and they're working together in tandem, adding the current together to produce a higher output.
Yeah, I can remember like back in the day there was Sanyo, and then they were bought up by Panasonic, and they had what they called Hetero Junction technology, where they had amorphous thin film with silicon, but that was probably different. It was like, I think that the cells were the same shape. It wasn't like you were just putting on some solar glass that matched the voltage.
Oh, that's exactly right. And HJT is still a popular technology. A lot of companies are pursuing a heterojunction technology. Even after Panasonic have more or less exited the market, there are a number of companies that have HJT.
So does it capture different wavelengths of light?
That's precisely how it works. We have a high band gap material, which means that we tend to absorb higher energy light. So really in that 1.65 EV and higher. So that puts you squarely like in that, blue-green part of the spectrum, whereas silicon is actually red near infrared.
Yeah, red and infrared. So you're more on the blue side.
That's right.
Do you go beyond blue? You don't go to UV or anything like that?
Well, there is a bit, right? So you're going to have the band gap. Anything above band gap, you're just less efficient at absorbing it. But if you're at the band gap, you're really very efficient at absorbing that. And so in the substrate that I showed you, you could see there was a little bit of an amber color to it, very dark red. And that's because it's just not absorbing that light. And that's what transmits through to the silicon. So the silicon absorbs really in its optimal frequency range, as does the perovskite. So you add the two together and you just absorb more available energy.
That's super cool. And so I have a kind of a weird thought is with bifacial solar, would you ever sandwich it, like put it on both sides?
No, it's actually not a bad thought, though. This is really great for bifacial, so you don't lose any of that bifaciality you would typically have for a crystalline silicon cell. And in fact, that glass package, what I mean by that is top glass, bottom glass, that's the best configuration for us too. It's just one of those glass substrates is going to be perovskite. And you can still get that backscatter absorption with a bifacial module, so you don't lose that bifaciality. Now, if you were to put a perovskite on the other end, you would just be absorbing more. Let's say if there's any of the higher frequency light would be absorbed by the perovskite versus the silicon. And there's some limited cases where, you can maybe play with the gap a little bit more, but ultimately you would probably want your silicon to absorb that backscattered light and have the perovskite really take more of that higher energy light that's coming in from the top surface.
So when you put it over the silicon cells, how much gets shaded from the silicon? Because I'm sure there's some shading going on, or it's taking away some of the light from the silicon.
It is absolutely. The silicon's going to see about half a sun. So one sun will be incident on the perovskite, and there'll be some absorption and filtering, and then you'll get about half a sun worth of light getting down to the silicon. And because of the electrical characteristics of silicon, maximum you're going to see as output from the silicon be about 0.45 of what its original value is. And that often gets asked. You have folks that have invested a lot in their crystalline silicon technology. And they say, well, gee, now the perovskite's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And it is, because it is a high band gap material. And it's oriented such that it sees the sun first. But when you combine the two together, you're going to get between a 25 and 35% boost in the power output of the module.
I wonder how many different technologies you could combine together. So how about this? Perovskite, in-layer, bifacial, half-cell, TopCon, PERC. Am I missing anything?
No, that's perfect. That's exactly what we're working on today. TopCon, PERC, Mono PERC, IBC, and HJT. Those are all technologies that we're working with.
So you could just like add it to anything pretty much.
Absolutely. And put a tracker on top of it with AI. And now you've got a pretty powerful solar array.
We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Sean White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSean, that's solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show. All right. So what part of the industry are you in? Are you manufacturing the cells? Are you making the technology? Or
we manufacture the cells. And so our business model it really takes it from the lens of a startup. I was in contract manufacturing for about 7 years at Flex. I ran the energy business there. And I learned a couple of tricks of the trade. And one of the things that's helpful is that if your customer can buy as many of the raw materials as you can, and particularly for a startup, that's helpful. So our customers will buy the glass and consign it to us. We'll coat it and then send it to their operations subsequently.
So that's what you're doing. You're making the glass. So you're not dealing with the silicon part of it. You're making the glass. And so it's like you're just making a special extra glass that somebody could use for their factory that's already set up and just like stick it on top instead of the regular glass.
That's exactly right. And even one step removed from that, we're just coating the glass. So we're just transforming it from a sheet of transparent glass into another set of solar cells that can then be shipped to the customer's module manufacturing location and integrated into the final product.
That's pretty cool. I like that. And are you manufacturing it in Southern California where you are?
Today we are. And so we're in the process of transitioning from our lab work into fab, so that lab to fab transition is happening. And our lab is co-located with the demonstration site that we have. And today it's about 50 megawatts of annual production. And we intend by the end of next year to scale that to 100 megawatts.
Great. Okay. And can you put multiple layers of what you're making right now, like perovskite? Can you put like layers? I'm sure it would work. Does it make any sense?
Well, I think the future is going to be multi-junction at some point. I think we want to get this two-junction technology working. There is a future where you could see a high and low band gap perovskite working in tandem, maybe with silicon or just two different band gap perovskites in the future, creating a very powerful and yet low cost solar module. So there's lots of different configurations. And frankly, we're a little surprised by how many thoughts there are around application. There's even the possibility of coupling this with other thin film technology.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense too. Yeah. Just like put layers of everything. Just put it on top of everything. Put it on your house, put it on your car,
Oh, I'd love to see in the future, longer term, I think where this technology goes is really going to be astonishing because of the manufacturing process. And we don't use a lot of vacuum technology in our process today. There's only a couple of steps that use vacuum technology, and that's for some sputtering work that we do. And that's really more of support layers for the stack. But this is room temperature to a large extent. Very low temperature deposition. It's done in solution phase, so fairly straightforward from that standpoint. Long term, I'd love to see, shipping containers going out and having little perovskite manufacturing operations, or even in space. You can imagine, when you're sitting up there on the moon, you need more solar panels instead of flying a new rocket out. Why don't you just take your flexible substrate material, put it through a printer, and then have a perovskite module come out the other end? So there's lots of things that we can do with this, and the flexibility is tremendous. In the future, you can look at clothing potentially, you could look at house paint. car paint, all of these things are definitely on the horizon. We chose to take on a fairly challenging slice, and that is terrestrial PV, but do it in the simplest and most cost-effective way you can. And that's by working with standard glass substrates. So there's no real difficulty in engineering the substrate and getting really good at that. And then once you get really good at that, then you can get into more exotic applications.
So it sounds like you're ready to move to the moon and you're down there in Southern California. Are you closer to JPL or SpaceX?
And we're closer to JPL. In fact, there's a few Caelux employees that have come out of JPL.
Oh, great. Okay. And so that's the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory over there near, I guess, near Pasadena. Is it La Canada Flint Ridge? Is that
That's
where it is?
exactly it. Yeah, La Cañada, Flint Ridge. I live in Pasadena. Caelux used to be in Pasadena. We still have a building there that we sublet, but we moved the operation to Baldwin Park, which is just about 10 miles east of Pasadena. There was just more available real estate that we could expand with.
If you go too far east of Pasadena, I think you're in the middle of a mountain.
Just along the 210.
Uh-huh. Okay, great. That's pretty awesome. And so you did mention Flex. And so I know that you did a lot with Flextronics. And I was reading that you were the one that purchased Nextracker. So you must know a lot about tracking systems and bifacial modules and all that kind of stuff. So Nextracker, I guess they're the biggest single axis tracker company in the world, I think, right now.
That's correct. Yeah, no, that team, Dan and his squad have done a fantastic job. And yeah, I was deal lead for that. And then Dan and I had the opportunity to work together for about 5 years while I was at Flex. That was our largest acquisition we had made. And we did a handful of others. And I would say most of them were pointed at adding additional capability to Nextracker's portfolio, specifically the true capture technology they had that brought some AI into the party for tracker operations. And I think that I look at Caelux really through that lens of here's a technology that can enhance energy harvest, much like we did in the tracker days, but it's a solid state approach to doing so, which is really, to me, the next leap. Module technology really hasn't evolved that much. When you take a look at it on the macro level since the 1970s, modules look about the same and efficiency's gone up. You could buy a really high-end module back in the day for 14%. It was super expensive. But, now we're looking at 23%, 24%. Not a huge leap forward in terms of efficiency. And I think while costs have come down tremendously, the industry really hasn't been focused much on efficiency improvement. And every improvement we would try to scrape out was in the fractions of a percent. And we had a large module operation at the time. We were a couple of gigawatts, and now that's nothing. But we were the third largest outside of China for many years. And I remember talking with customers and figuring out how we're going to go and eke out a couple of tenths of a point of percent efficiency. And in our case today at Caelux, we're going to launch a product that's going to deliver. The first product will come out first half this year of 25, and that'll deliver about 3 to 3.5% absolute efficiency improvement, which is a huge leap forward. But it pales in comparison what our final release product will be at the end of 25, which will be about 6% of absolute efficiency boost, which is just astronomical. And when I talk to developers downstream, that really excites them. And I wrote a piece recently about some of the issues with TopCon in the United States and how looking at, let's say, mono PERC technology coupled with Perovskites can help fill that gap in the short term. So there's a lot going on that I think points to a bright future for technology like ours. And I think we're probably the best positioned to go and intercept some of these megatrends.
Great. And so there's all these different technologies that we've been talking about, Perovskite, TopCon, PERC, all that kind of stuff. And do you think, like, just for the regular person that's purchasing modules to install them, does it really matter as much which technology it is or how much the efficiency is?
I think it's going to really, you as a person or as a consumer is really going to care about what's the fastest way I can break even on this installation I put up on my house. And if you have a technology where the cost per watt is relatively flat, but can give you an additional 5 to 6% absolute efficiency improvement or 30% higher yield, that should just accelerate that payback period for you.
Yeah.
And clearly the way that we price the product is such that everybody has the possibility, is going to have some upside. We obviously make a margin. The module company be able to sell at a slight premium. And the consumer, whether they're a utility, an asset owner, an IPP, a homeowner, will be able to participate in that upside too, meaning that you'll see a faster payback on that installation.
So also, what do you think about the advent of super cheap solar now? I've read an article recently that was talking about 6 cents per watt in Europe for PV modules. It just seems so inexpensive. It's like, how much is the aluminum? How much is the glass? How much are the conductors? Like, what gives? Is this stuff any good? I mean, how can it be good if it's pretty much as cheap as the glass and the aluminum?
Yeah, and well, the issue we see an artificiality in the market today, and that's driven by, I think, just a runaway industrial policy in China that has since gone through some corrections and will continue to go through corrections over the next 12 months. There was excess capacity to a significant degree in China. And unfortunately, there's companies in China that we've never heard of that are quite large in supporting the domestic industry. Your top five producers probably have 500 gigawatts of production capacity themselves, which is significant. So we are seeing some corrections. We're seeing Southeast Asia operations being mothballed from many of these top tier solar players. And that's driven mostly by the fact that the US is putting up trade barriers and tariffs for components coming out of certain manufacturers from what's called the 4CAC countries. And that includes Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Malaysia. And that's likely to extend. And so the Southeast Asia manufacturing base, which was pointed towards the US, is effectively shrinking. There are producers that are moving to Indonesia, and I wonder when that's going to be addressed as well. So we're likely to see trade cases. I wouldn't be surprised if there was something to look at Indonesia. And then China itself just had a tremendous amount of overcapacity. And that's what you're seeing is the net result. When you're looking at the cost to produce polysilicon, and I had dinner with the CFO at one of the largest polysilicon producers a few months back when I was at SNEC, and he shared with me that his cash cost was about $6 a kilogram. And at that time, he was selling for about 8. And now I think the prices have dropped around 5. And it's not sustainable. And so we're going to see a lot of consolidation. I do think we'll see a big reset, just like we did back in 2016, 2017. And the market did come back. We saw prices go from 68 cents a watt in January of 2016 to 25 cents by December. And at the time, everybody was bemoaning the fact that, oh, this is impossible. Well, it did bounce back a little bit, and it did, but then it continued to come down. We will see a rebound in the market, I think, in about 12 months or so, but it won't be to that where it was before. And we'll see a lot of consolidation. We'll see, I think, a shakeup in terms of who the top 5 players are internationally. And I think that we're going to see the advent of the perovskite technologies really come into the forefront. We look at that as an opportunity and not as a risk to the market. For us, we can index our technology against these low-cost modules and still perform quite well from a techno-economic perspective, meaning that the amount that we charge doesn't tip the scales. There's actually still a premium in the market for higher efficiency technologies. And in the US, that thumb rule is roughly for every 1% of absolute efficiency improvement, you can get 2 cents per watt premium. In other geographies, that could be as low as a penny to a penny and a half per watt premium for every full percent of efficiency improvement over the median. And so all that kind of factors out to, yes, we see really good technology being sold for dirt cheap, and that's just to liquidate inventory. There will be a correction as supply and demand come better in line with one another, but we will be at a new low. It won't be 6 cents anymore, maybe back in the low double digits, i.e. low teens. But still, that's pretty low. And so that's what it looks like. But in the US, we won't see those prices.
Yep. With the tariffs and everything. And speaking of tariffs, we do have a political shift, and there's the Inflation Reduction Act, and some people are nervous, and, lots of people that are in the middle of building factories. How do you think that's going to affect everything?
Well, I think that there's a degree of apprehension, I think, across the industry. We've taken the perspective that we're going to lean into some of the policies that the new administration is pushing forward, and that's specifically around job creation and growth, made in America, energy independence, energy security, and grid resiliency. And we think that those are going to be dominant themes, and then we're well positioned to go and intersect those themes. In terms of how we see it potentially impacting the industry as far as some of these factories being built out, it was interesting to see the transaction that Trina had recently executed in selling their assets to Freyr. And that was a surprise, but it was 2 days after the election. I think their perspective was that bills that will prevent Chinese-owned entities from taking advantage of IRA provisions are likely to gain some steam. And so we could see some changes in ownership occur, a la what we saw with Trina. Likewise, I think that the deal that LONGi and Invenergy had put together was quite interesting. And this is for their operations, their 5 gigawatt operation in Ohio. Fortunately, I forgot the name of the company that they created, but we may see joint venture type relationships like that, though it's rumored that there will be limits in terms of the percent ownership that a Chinese participant can have. And I think it's as low as 20%. And I believe in that case, LONGi is a 40% partner. So we may see some changes there. I think that the solar train has left the station. Just as an example, during the last Trump administration, we doubled the size of our renewable energy business at Flex. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, we did shift. We did find more made in America opportunities. We did some nearshoring in order to bolster that. And so long as I think we're feeding the let's go make American jobs story and we're executing on that story, it's not just talk. I feel pretty good about where I think things are going to land. And, recently over the summer, there were 18 Republican congressmen who sent a letter to Speaker Johnson requesting that IRA provisions not be impacted because of the job creation opportunities in their districts. So kudos to the industry for being smart about setting up shop in these politically influential districts. But also, I think the reality is that energy transition is happening. Solar is going to become a larger and larger part of the energy mix. And that's just a fact. And we can either create American jobs around that fact, or we can choose to outsource those jobs. And I think that we'll end up choosing the former versus the latter.
So for your factory too, I guess you're probably, getting help from the IRA, I guess.
We are indeed. We are a beneficiary of the IRA. It hasn't hit us yet, but we are registering for the tax credit that will start for us next year. We've sold into a large solar project already in Q1. So we'll be shipping product in Q1 to a large solar project. And this is not to oversell it. This is really for test and development, but it's over 100 kilowatts, right? And that's what we're really targeting to do next year, is to get a number of these projects strung together that will help create the database that independent engineers are going to need for their calculations and assessment of future solar projects using Caelux technology. And we think that also gives us a nice on-ramp for the residential market too. So, we're looking at all the markets, commercial, residential, utility, and then we're addressing all of them simultaneously. But that's really what our ambition is to start that in the field, true data collection with product, so we understand the behavior of these unique materials and how they contribute to the success of a solar project.
So with your technology, are you looking for customers that have solar factories and you're selling them pretty much the glass with a perovskite on it?
That's right. Yeah, that's our customers today are module companies, but we do work with IPPs and developers to really educate them. And I think it's important that they know about these technologies. And they're the ones who are sending the demand signals to the market. They're saying, I need a module that does X, Y, and Z. And our message to them is pretty straightforward. Their market is really constrained in a number of ways, particularly in the US, but we see this internationally. It used to be we didn't worry much about the size of a solar project. We thought there was more land than you could possibly take advantage of. And the reality is quite different. Land is under more and more scrutiny. There are communities that don't want solar, whether it's for aesthetic reasons or they have some falsely held notion that it causes cancer, which fortunately is the case in some parts of the country, or they just feel that land is better used for agricultural use versus energy production, which, okay, could be legitimate. So now you're working with more difficult to leverage land assets, so it means smaller projects. So energy density really becomes important. Construction costs are quite high. So how do you mitigate construction costs? Well, you try to get your panels to actually produce more power per unit area. So again, smaller project, lower balance of systems costs, and all these factors really conspire to push developers to look at low cost, super high energy density technologies like ours.
So do you have particular manufacturers that you're working with right now?
We have 12.
12 of them. And is it like, do you want to mention them or we could just look it up somewhere?
Yeah, you could probably glean it from our website, but we are working with 3 of the top 5, soon to be 4 of the top 5 producers in the world.
And are you making it for people that are outside of the US? Like, are you sending your glass outside of the US or?
In some cases we are, and in some cases domestically. Yeah, like they'll do testing, for example, overseas, And then they'll plan to go ahead and use their, let's say, US based operations would be the seat for the technology to go to market.
And so, do you have like different pieces of glass, say, for instance, for half cell modules? Are there like parallel connections inside the glass or anything like that? Or is it a special junction box?
No, we don't really deal with that. What a customer will give us is a CAD drawing of their module, and that will design our active glass device to match that. And we
Hmm.
could do that with laser scribing. And so we can do everything that we need. We don't have to even adjust the size. We get the size from them. Now, we just have a limitation on length, and that's really just because of our equipment that we have here. But our next expansion will be able to do much larger modules. But everybody's going about the same width, and it's between 1100 and 1200 millimeters across. And the width is really the hardest thing to solve for. Once you can solve width, the length is really meaningless. And so, from our standpoint, we can then match our device to meet the voltage requirements for the customer. And we can scribe other scribes in there to go, let's say, match different junction box placements should they have that. And so we make it as painless as we possibly can for the customer. Give us your design and we'll design around you. In some cases, they choose to optimize it even further. They may use it as an excuse to come out with a new module and say, well, if we can just squeeze a little bit more out of the edges and we go to this size substrate, we're able to do more. And we're not restricted. We could care less if it's a G10, G12, M10, N12, M6. We don't care.
Yeah.
You tell us what it is. We'll just program the recipe of the laser scriber to support whatever geometry you have.
I've heard of some people saying that the larger modules, because the modules are getting really big these days,
Right.
and some people are thinking like, oh, they're more efficient because they're 500 or 600 watts, but a lot of it just has to do with the PV modules are getting bigger. And I've heard some people say that they're more breakable because if you take the same glass, you make it really bigger, and then it vibrates more. And do you have an opinion on that?
I think that's true. I mean, that's just basic physics. Yeah. And you're not going thicker on the glass. If there's any trend, it's going thinner. So now you got a longer and thinner sheet of glass that you're working with, and it's going to be less mechanically resilient. If you were to go and adopt that longer module and make the glass thicker to compensate for this larger moment arm that you have, that's really what you've created, is just a larger moment arm so that you've got more force at the end of the module if it's longer than if you took the same size module and put the equal amount of force at that end. So yeah, it just stands to reason that you would see a greater breakage. I've heard rumors that, when in certain configurations that they're finding and using trackers that they're seeing these modules break more. That's again rumor. Data may show something quite a bit different, but nonetheless, I think you will see less mechanical robustness the longer and longer you go.
Yeah, maybe we should like have a limit to how big they get if we want them to last a long time.
But I think maybe once our products come out, we may see some of these notions being revisited. So if you
Hmm.
can have a 600, 700 watt module that can be shorter, is that good enough? Is that something everybody wants? I mean, we have that flexibility, of course.
Yeah, or maybe like if they get so long it gets breakable, maybe they can make them wider instead of longer or something like that.
Yeah, that would make it harder for us, but
I'm sure you could figure it out. You guys are
yeah, we
smart.
just need
Yeah.
bigger tools.
You've got rocket scientists working for you.
We do. Literal rocket scientists, yes.
Yeah. So a little bit about your career at Flex. And so Flex, I've heard of like has the biggest factories in the world, right? I think they make like Enphase and iPhones and all kinds of stuff. Or am I wrong?
No, you're right about Enphase. iPhones, I think there's a couple other folks like Foxconn and Jabil that are in that world. But I've been out of Flex for about 5 years now. At the time, we had SolarEdge, we had Enphase was one of our largest customers. Sun Edison, back when they were building projects, was our very large customer of ours.
And you were saying it was outside of China?
That's correct.
Because they are in China also, right?
That's correct. So Enphase's situation, we had the factory in China.
Uh-huh.
I was referring to the largest. It was the PV module manufacturing side for us was outside of China. So we did that in Malaysia, Mexico, California, and Canada at one point in time,
Cool.
and Brazil.
Yeah, I've heard that there's some of these factories like in Shenzhen and stuff like that
Right.
that are just so big. They're like bigger than cities that people live in them or.
That's true. When we had dormitories,
Hmm.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, we had a one site, Zhuhai, not too far from Hong Kong. that was a massive campus, and we had
Hmm.
dormitories, and all the contract manufacturers and most manufacturers have dormitories, and you're taking people from more impoverished parts of the country that want to work in a Western firm, make good money, and then repatriate, go back to their hometown with,
Hmm.
or they're sending cash back on a monthly basis, and very hardworking people.
So yeah, I'd like to go just see some of these like giant, huge factories that are like have more people in them than some countries, I guess.
Yeah.
Like.
Oh no, they can be huge factories. That's
Uh-huh.
right.
Yeah.
And at the time when I joined, we were about 300 million in revenue, and we grew that to almost about $2 billion. And most of that was in solar. And a good half of that at the time was Nextracker. And since then, they've grown tremendously. But, it's definitely when I think about the advantages in coming into that structure, like what Nextracker did, the advantage really was the company's balance sheet and their ability to work with a number of different projects because they had the Flex balance sheet, they had the parent guarantees that would come there from Flex that would help support the growth. And I see the same thing for us, and that's why we don't make modules. I was challenged before I took this role, like, gee, you should make modules. And I told the investors, well, then you should probably find somebody else because it'll take you 10 years to get to market. You can get to market a lot sooner if you work with a module company, have them qualify your product, go through their rigorous requirements, and they're the front to the
Hmm.
developer in terms of warranty obligations, because it's difficult for a startup to bring a new module technology to market. And because of that bankability question, you may have the best product in the world, but you don't have the balance sheet to support the warranty obligations. And so by working with these giants, you can then have that balance sheet behind it that can support the warranties.
Yeah. Instead of working against them, you're working with them. You just have another layer of stuff to put on it.
Make them look good.
Uh-huh.
That's our
Yep.
job.
Uh-huh. Are there other people that are, using your business model, stealing all your ideas?
Our business model seems to be fairly unique in the industry.
Cool. Yeah. All right. In Perovskite too, it's kind of a new thing, or at least where it's been somewhat efficient and competitive and things like that. I mean, I guess it's kind of brand new. Who invented it for solar anyway?
Well, I wish I could tell you the team's name, but they were in Japan. It was in
Mhm.
2009, and this one came out of the whole dye sensitized solar cell effort. You probably remember that from about 10, 15 years ago. And it came out of that world. So when they were doing organic PV and dye sensitized solar cells, these perovskite materials were discovered, and they found that, wow, they were extremely efficient, but they lasted seconds. And, everybody scoffed at it. And I never had much an opinion because, I thought, well, that's just a science project. And I had been in thin film silicon, I had been in SIGs, and I'd been in crystalline silicon really for the bulk of my career. And, thought, well, that's kind of cool. Maybe it'll work one day. And we're getting closer. These perovskite technologies are often derided for their poor lifetimes. And the reality is those lifetimes have improved dramatically. In the 70s, there was 1 year warranty on crystalline silicon modules. And there was a prompt shift in about 2005. They went from 10-year warranties to 20-year warranties. And that wasn't because there was a whole body of knowledge and a lot of engineering. No, the reality was that was a marketing decision to go and make that leap. And today, our perovskites are about 12 years, which is getting to be good enough. And what I mean by good enough is that the module is going to generate more power for the first 22 years of its life than it will, than it would otherwise. So you've got a 20-year PPA, 22 years, you're going to get more energy enhancement. With a 12 and a half year T80 and a T80 meaning time to 80% of its original efficiency, and let's say 15% efficient top glass, which will give you 3.5% bump in your absolute efficiency. Well, that's pretty good. You're still for 22 years, you're going to be above what you would have been with crystalline silicon. And then after 22 years, it will drop below. Our full release product, well, those curves will never intersect. You'll be more power coming out of your module over the lifetime of that module than it ever would be without the perovskite layer. So we're not that far off as an industry. And there were studies I've seen come out from places like Caelux that talk about, oh, you got to be 25-year efficiency. That's absolutely wrong. It's absolutely incorrect. And then nobody's taken the time to do the simple math. And it's really easy. You look at the degradation of crystalline silicon in one column, you look at the degradation of perovskite in your next column, add them together, and you can see exactly how those behave.
I got an idea for you. You get bifacial with a perovskite on one side, and then after 20 years, you flip it.
You're not the first person. And that's what we say is a risk mitigation.
Man, I didn't think of it.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You can flip it over. We get asked a lot, hey, is this something you can do aftermarket? And I know there's a couple of companies working on that. Our view is this, is that the simplest and safest, most reliable way for you to repower a project will be replace the modules that you have because you have the infrastructure in place already. Replace those modules with more powerful, lower cost modules than what you started the project with. And that's where we kind of feature in that. But you're absolutely correct about the flipping the bifacial.
Cool. All right. And then how about this? Triple junction, quadruple junction. Has anybody thought of that?
Yes,
And I think actually, like on the NREL chart, they do have some kind of like world record efficiency breaker that has got something like that, like multiple junctions and 300 suns, a concentrated sun on it. But I imagine with the perovskite like you have, you could probably put different layers on it.
that's right. You can. In fact, our founder, John Iannelli, he's one of the top thinkers in terms of multi-junction cells. And he was on that chart. He told me once for 4 hours before Boeing. And so he had the world record for 4 hours.
Uh-huh.
And it was doing exactly that, multiple junction solar cells. And those were typically 1 square centimeter cells that were fantastic for space applications, great for concentrating PV for terrestrial applications. And that's exactly on our roadmap. You just have to tune every one of those layers, have to have a slightly different band gap. You got to make sure you get as much sunlight as you can to the next layer below that, and the next layer below that. It's a lot of engineering. But yeah, triple junction, we definitely see that as one of the future states for what we want to get done. We want to get our single junction hybrid tandem off the ground, but our view was we needed to find a pathway to commercialize this technology as quickly as possible to generate the cash required to invest back in the business, to then investigate these follow-on necessary products. And so I think these multi-junction cells are going to be the future. And with perovskites, you can do them very inexpensively.
Okay, great. So, how about in 10 years, we'll have you back here on the podcast. We'll talk about the triple junction. And then in 20 years, we'll talk about the quadruple junction.
I think that would be fantastic. And we
Uh,
can talk about our 35% modules and all this other good stuff, which I think is a reality.
and we'll do it from the moon
There we go.
with some of your rocket scientist engineers there in the background.
Exactly.
Great. Okay, cool. Well, I've learned a ton. Let's see, is there any other things that you want to talk about or cover?
No, I think that's about it. We managed to close our first part of our Series B financing, and we're continuing to do that. So we closed about 26 million this year. We're going to close another, hopefully, 10 to 20-ish.
Hey, I'll kick in a couple $100 too, you
Hey,
know?
that's all right.
Uh-huh.
Every penny counts. But, I think if you kind of compare the initiative in the US compared to China, I think that's probably one last thing I'd want to hit. It's been lackluster by comparison. The commitment that I think that China's had to perovskites exceeds what we've seen in the US. I think that the US has been far too timid in wanting to really help reset the photovoltaic landscape. And it's really fallen to forward-thinking investors in the private sector to really take this and move it forward. Whereas in China, there's been a tremendous amount of government support for it. But, we've had to think on our feet. There's a good and a bad. And the good that comes out of, I think, more of an austere climate is you've got to get really creative very quickly. And that kind of pushed us towards technology decisions that have ultimately really paid off, such that we believe that we can manufacture more inexpensively than the Chinese can. And that's because we've eliminated process steps. And that was out of necessity.
Great, great. Well, I imagine I'll probably bump into you in some solar show. Do you go to like RE Plus? And I
I
heard you
do.
say SNEC.
No, I do. Yeah,
Yeah, and so I try to usually go to RE Plus and SNEC and Intersolar over there in Germany. So I'll go look for you next time I'm there.
that'd be fantastic, Sean. No, that would be
Hmm.
great. It'd be good to meet you face to face.
Great, awesome. Thanks so much.
Yep.
And where can people find you?
So they can find us at caelux.com, Caelux.com. They can find us on LinkedIn as well. And we've got a lot of great posts on there. Our marketing squad does a great job in finding bits about perovskites as well as just general industry information. And so a lot of great information out there for you.
Great. Well, thanks, Scott Graybeal, who is the CEO of Caelux. And Caelux makes this really cool Perovskite glass. Everybody's got to get it. I want to get Perovskite glasses. I think they'll look cool. I'll get some stripes going through there. I can still see through them. I could get extra energy into my body. I just got to have to figure out how to wire them into my brain. And thanks for listening to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Go ahead and get yourself NABCEP certified.